I know how this sounds. A woman with a 103-degree fever sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by medical bills and prescription bottles, staring at an empty glass of water while her husband sits 20 feet away in a gaming headset. I know how it looks. But let me explain how I got here, because the full story is worse than you think. I was raised to be the strong one, the woman who handles everything, the fixer, the one who turns chaos into order while everyone else gets to simply exist. I thought that's what love was supposed to look like. Competence as devotion, sacrifice as proof. When I married Mark at 28, I believed I'd found someone who would finally match that energy. I was wrong. When Mark contracted sepsis at 31, I didn't hesitate. I became a medical advocate overnight. I learned to decode insurance claims, memorized FMLA requirements like they were wedding vows, and transformed our dining room into a command center of pill schedules and wound care protocols. I spent 42 days arguing with insurance companies who treated his life like a line item. 3 weeks sleeping in a plastic hospital chair that made my spine feel like broken glass. 2 months managing a PICC line so precise that one wrong move could send infection straight to his heart. I pulled him back from the edge of death through sheer force of will and administrative competence. And here's what surprised me during those endless ICU nights. Part of me wished it was me in that bed instead. Not in some noble, self-sacrificing way. In a dark, honest way that terrified me. I pushed that feeling down because there was too much to do. Too many doctors to coordinate. Too many forms to file. Too many battles with billing departments to fight. I told myself I'd dissect those feelings later when he was safe. He came home after a week in the ICU, still weak, still unable to walk without assistance. And I kept going. I took care of everything. Managing his bosses at work, filing FMLA, paperwork, scheduling follow-up appointments, preparing meals that wouldn't stress his recovering organs, monitoring his vitals every 4 hours like I was his private nurse. On top of everything I was already doing. On top of being a full human being with my own needs. That's when I started to understand what had made me feel that way in the hospital. I started to understand that he had never done the same for me. I know that might sound unfair, so let me share the evidence. The pattern I couldn't see until his sepsis forced me to look at our entire marriage under hospital fluorescent lighting. Before we begin, tell us in the comments from which city are you watching. And at the end, do not forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The fever started on a Tuesday, but Mark didn't mention it until Thursday when I found him shivering under 3 blankets in July. By Friday morning, his skin had turned the color of old newspaper, and he couldn't stand without his legs buckling. I knew before the doctor said the word. Sepsis. The kind of infection that doesn't negotiate. The kind that kills you in the time it takes to argue about whether you really need to go to the hospital. I didn't argue. I had him in the car before he could finish saying he'd probably feel better tomorrow. The ER was a fluorescent nightmare of beeping machines and that specific smell of antiseptic trying to cover up fear. They took him back immediately, which is never a good sign. That's when I felt the switch flip inside me. The wife part of my brain shut off, and the medical lead part powered up like an emergency generator. I stopped being the person who holds his hand, and started being the person who holds the clipboard. I memorized the names of every nurse. I wrote down medication dosages in the Notes app on my phone. I asked questions about his white blood cell count that made the attending physician actually look impressed. They admitted him within an hour. Septic shock, they said. Another 12 hours and we'd be having a very different conversation. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I pulled up a plastic chair next to his bed, opened a new note on my phone titled Mark Medical, and started building the infrastructure that would keep him alive. That's what I did. That's what I always did. I built the safety net so he could fall without consequence. Nobody tells you that saving someone's life is 70% paperwork and 30% prayer. The medical staff handled the sepsis. I handled everything else. FMLA forms that read like they were designed by someone who hated both families and medical leave. Insurance claims that required a master's degree in bureaucratic torture to decode. Prior authorizations for medications that cost more than our rent. I learned terms like explanation of benefits and out-of-network provider, the way other people learn a second language, except this language only had one translation. You're going to fight for every single dollar. I set up a system. Color-coded folders for different insurance companies. A spreadsheet tracking every medication, every dosage, every refill date. A separate calendar just for his doctor appointments because our regular calendar couldn't contain the sheer volume of medical coordination required to keep one man alive. I called his boss 6 times to explain FMLA protections because apparently my husband nearly died wasn't self-explanatory enough. I spent 40-minute holds with insurance companies arguing about why a life-saving antibiotic wasn't considered medically necessary. And I did it all alone. Mark was too weak to help, they said. Too foggy from the medication. Too overwhelmed by his own recovery. Which I understood, which I accepted, which I told myself was temporary. But here's what nobody mentions about becoming someone's medical advocate. You stop being their partner and start being their personal healthcare administrator, and administrators don't get to collapse. They don't get to be scared. They certainly don't get to ask for help. They just keep filing. They say you can't sleep in an ICU, but exhaustion is a powerful negotiator. I learned to sleep sitting up in a chair designed by someone who had never experienced a human spine. 21 days in that chair, 3 weeks of sleeping in 40-minute intervals between the vitals checks that came every 4 hours like clockwork. The nurses started bringing me extra blankets without me asking. One of them, Marie, brought me coffee that tasted like burned regret but kept me conscious enough to advocate when the doctors made their rounds at 6 a.m. The smell became part of me. That specific combination of industrial antiseptic, sanitized air, and the underlying current of sickness that no amount of cleaning solution could mask. It soaked into my clothes, my hair, my skin. I'd catch whiffs of it weeks later and feel my chest tighten with muscle memory. On day 17, when his fever finally broke and the attending said he'd probably make it, I made a vow. Sitting in that plastic torture device they called a chair, watching him sleep without the ventilator for the first time in a week, I promised myself I would get him home. I would rebuild whatever version of our life existed on the other side of this. I would be strong enough for both of us. It felt noble in that moment, like the kind of promise that defines a marriage. The in sickness and in health part, made real and visceral. I didn't know yet that I was making a vow to a man who would never think to make the same one back. I didn't know I was promising to give everything to someone who had already decided I was inexhaustible. I thought bringing him home would feel like victory, but it felt more like I just extended my shift indefinitely. Mark came through the door like royalty returning from exile. I had prepared everything. The bedroom set up with extra pillows for elevation. Medications organized by time of day, a meal plan that accommodated his dietary restrictions, a binder with all his discharge instructions, follow-up appointments, and emergency protocols. I had turned our home into a recovery facility with myself as the only staff member. He settled into the recliner I'd bought specifically for his recovery and reached for the TV remote before he'd even thanked me for the ride home. Within an hour, he was asking when dinner would be ready. By day 2, he was annoyed that I'd woken him up to take his antibiotics on schedule. By day 3, he'd stopped saying please. The gratitude I'd expected never materialized. Instead, I got a patient who believed his near-death experience entitled him to permanent room service. He couldn't walk to the kitchen without assistance, he said, so I brought him everything. He was too weak to manage his own medications, he claimed, so I became his personal pharmacist. He needed to focus on healing, he insisted, so I handled literally everything else. And I was so tired. The kind of tired that lives in your bones. Months of sleeping in hospital chairs had rewired my nervous system to expect interruption. I'd wake up at 2 a.m. in my own bed, convinced I'd missed a vitals check that didn't exist anymore. But he was healing, getting stronger every day. I was the one starting to break. By week 6 of his recovery, Mark was strong enough to sit at his gaming setup for 8 hours straight, but too weak to bring me a glass of water. The blue light from his monitor became the third presence in our home. It cast this cold, artificial glow across the living room, turning everything it touched into something distant and unreal. He sat there in his gaming chair, the expensive one with lumbar support he'd bought himself as a recovery gift, wearing those over-ear headphones with the glowing LED rings that meant he couldn't hear me even if I screamed. I would sit at the kitchen table 20 feet away, surrounded by the evidence of his survival. Medical bills spread across the surface like accusatory paperwork. Prescription bottles lined up like soldiers who'd already lost the war. FMLA forms I was still filing because his short-term disability claim had been denied twice. And I would watch that blue light pulse and flicker as he played whatever game had consumed him that week, and I started to understand something terrible. The headphones weren't just an accessory. They were a choice, a physical manifestation of his decision to tune out everything that wasn't entertainment. To exist in a world where my voice asking for help was just background noise he could mute. He'd healed enough to game for hours, to coordinate raids with strangers online, to laugh into his microphone at jokes I'd never hear. But when I'd gotten sick 3 days ago, with what I suspected was a secondary infection from months of exhaustion, when I'd developed a fever that made my skin feel like it was burning from the inside out, he couldn't hear me ask for the most basic human kindness. The blue light stayed on, my glass stayed empty. The fever hit on a Wednesday, exactly 3 months after I'd brought Mark home from the hospital alive. 103 degrees. The kind of fever that makes your teeth chatter and your thoughts blur at the edges. I recognized the symptoms immediately because I'd spent weeks monitoring them in someone else. Fatigue so profound it felt like gravity had doubled. Body aches that turned every movement into negotiation. The metallic taste in my mouth that meant my immune system had finally waved a white flag after months of running on fumes and adrenaline. I called for Mark from the kitchen table where I'd collapsed among his medical paperwork. My voice came out smaller than I intended. He didn't respond. The blue light from his monitor kept pulsing. I called again, louder this time, and watched him lean closer to his screen, fully absorbed in whatever virtual crisis required his immediate attention. I expected him to turn around. I'd earned that, hadn't I? 3 months of IV management, medication schedules, insurance battles, and sleeping in chairs had to be worth at least the basic acknowledgement of my existence. I'd pulled him back from the edge of death. Surely that deposited enough in the reciprocity bank to withdraw 1 moment of care. But the headphones stayed on. The game continued, and I sat there shaking with fever, staring at the empty glass in front of me, understanding with devastating clarity that the strong one doesn't get to break. The fixer doesn't get to be fixed. The person who does everything has married someone who's learned he can do nothing. I'd saved his life and somehow lost mine in the process. I reached for the empty glass, and my hand was shaking so badly I nearly knocked it over. The water dispenser on the fridge was 20 feet away. It might as well have been 20 miles. My legs felt like they'd been filled with wet sand. I tried to stand and my vision tunneled at the edges, that specific graying that means your body is negotiating whether to keep you conscious. I sat back down hard enough that the chair scraped against the floor. Mark didn't turn around. I said his name. Nothing. I said it louder. Still nothing. The blue light from his headphones pulsed in rhythm with whatever game audio was more important than my voice. I watched him lean forward, intense, focused, his hands moving across the keyboard with the kind of precision and care I hadn't seen directed at me in months. I picked up one of his prescription bottles and dropped it. The rattle of pills against plastic. He shifted in his chair but didn't turn. I knocked over the stack of medical bills, papers scattering across the floor like evidence at a crime scene. He adjusted his headphones, pressing them tighter against his ears. That's when I understood. This wasn't about volume. This wasn't about him not hearing me. The headphones were a barrier he chose to build. Every time he put them on, he was making a decision about whose needs mattered. Every raid he prioritized, every quest he couldn't pause, every stranger's voice he responded to while ignoring mine was a choice. He could take them off. He just didn't want to. I was burning with fever in a room with the man I'd saved, and he'd chosen the blue light over me. I looked down at the medical bills scattered across the table and started doing math that had nothing to do with money. 42 days of insurance calls, 21 nights in a hospital chair, 16 doctor appointments I scheduled, attended, and took notes at, while Mark zoned out on pain medication. 8 FMLA forms I filled out because he couldn't be bothered to read the instructions. 3 medication schedules I memorized so thoroughly I could recite them at 3 a.m. without looking. 1 PICC line I learned to clean and dress with the precision of a trained nurse because hiring help wasn't covered by insurance. And in return, 0 glasses of water, 0 moments of concern, 0 questions about how I was feeling. 0 acknowledgement that the person who saved his life might also have a body that could break. I picked up one of his prescription bottles, the antibiotics that cost $340 after insurance. I'd fought for these, spent 90 minutes on hold, filed an appeal, called his doctor's office 4 times to get the prior authorization pushed through. I'd done all of that so he could live. And he'd lived his way right back to the gaming chair, to the headphones, to a life where my needs were just interference he could mute. That's when I understood what I'd actually done. I hadn't just saved his life. I'd enabled a pattern that was killing mine. By being so competent, so capable, so endlessly able to handle everything, I taught him he didn't have to try. My strength had become his permission slip for weakness. My hypercompetence had made him incompetent by choice. I didn't save our marriage by saving his life. I just gave him more time to ignore mine. I stood up, and this time I didn't let my body negotiate me back down. The walk to the fridge took everything I had. My fever spiked with each step, sweat soaking through my tank top, but I made it. I filled the glass myself, drank it standing at the sink, the cold water shocking against my burning throat. Then I filled it again and carried it back to the table, past the man in the headphones who still hadn't turned around. And something crystallized in that moment, something cold and clear and utterly final. I'd spent our entire marriage being the person who fixed things, who handled things, who made everything so easy for him that he forgot how to function without me doing the work. I thought that's what love looked like. Competence as devotion, sacrifice as proof, my strength as the foundation he could build his comfort on. But you can't pour life into someone who refuses to hold the cup. You can't save someone who won't save you back. And being the fixer doesn't make you valuable, it just makes you exhausted. I looked at the medical bills, the prescription bottles, the FMLA paperwork that represented months of my life spent keeping him alive. I'd navigated insurance companies, learned medical terminology, became fluent in bureaucratic warfare, all so he could survive. And he'd survived his way right back to indifference. The blue light kept glowing, the headphones stayed on, and I understood that this wasn't a marriage anymore. This was a caretaking facility where I was the only employee, and the patient had just decided his recovery was complete enough for entertainment, but not for basic human reciprocity. I drank my water. and I started planning my exit. Here's what they don't tell you about being the strong one. You're teaching someone else how to be weak. Every time I fixed something he could have handled, I sent a message that he didn't need to try. Every crisis I managed alone proved he could opt out without consequence. My competence became his permission slip for incompetence. By making myself indispensable, I made him dependent in the worst way. Not because he couldn't function, but because he'd learned he didn't have to. You cannot be both the fixer and the fixed. Eventually, the person doing all the repair work breaks down themselves, and when they do, they discover the devastating truth. Hypercompetence doesn't inspire gratitude. It inspires entitlement. I saved his life but lost my own in the process. If this story touched you, remember you don't need to be a champion to make a difference. You need the courage to stand for what's right, the humility to admit you're wrong, and the generosity to lift others up. That is the kind of strength that changes the world. Thank you for watching to the end. If today's story touched you even a little, please hit subscribe so you won't miss new episodes every week. Which moment did you like most in the story? Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video so the algorithm knows you want more. Stories of justice and healing. If you're watching from a particular city, share where you're tuning in from. I'd love to see how wide our community reaches. See you next episode. A secret unlocked by a late apology. Tap the bell to get notified the moment it goes live.